Back here now to talk some more about Hard Knocks, the offseason version, following the New York Giants over this offseason. A special one because it is their 100th season. So what went down, some big transactions and just actions overall with the Giants in free agency, the draft. It's a good thing they selected them because they became a big story, and there's a lot of entertaining things just to take from the first episode. And I couldn't move on from the first episode without talking about this conversation between John Mara and general manager Joe Schoen. John Mara is the owner of the New York Giants, and it was a very brief one, but I thought it did hold a lot of just significance overall to the first episode and how the Saquon Barkley process just went through, because this conversation took place on February 13th over Saquon, if they were going to tag him and then try to look for a trade market for him, or if they were just willing to let him hit free agency. Obviously, they just let him hit free agency, but some more context behind it. General manager Joe Schoen was explaining to John Mara in the scene how he didn't want to offer that $7 million salary that they had in mind, that they were valuing Saquon at, probably roughly about $7 million, because he wanted to avoid the just wave of criticism, talking points from the media on the Giants just offered Saquon $7 million. Like, how dare they disrespect him? How dare they offer him so little for everything that they did? Or just having to try to avoid this becoming a massive thing. He was a little bit hesitant over offering that $7 million salary because of that. So they had to at least move on a little bit, and they were going to be open to trading him if no offer came. If no offer came after that, their first option, they were going to look to trade him, obviously to get something back. But if no offer came, and no offer did come, they'd be okay with letting him hit free agency and find his market. This was the plan, right? No trade. Trade was the first thing that happens. If no offers come in, because teams outside of the Giants obviously have the leverage, knowing that Saquon is going to be a free agent anyway, so why would they offer a trade? They could just wait a little bit longer. I'm sure a lot of other teams were getting an intel or a sense that the Giants weren't going to franchise tag him again. So they were buying their time, waiting until free agency, getting that feeling that the Giants were just going to let him hit free agency. But overall, the plan was, if no offer came in, they'd be okay with letting him hit free agency, find any other value that other teams are offering, find his market, and then they expected Saquon to come back and let them know if they could match another offer that he had. You know, if he got one from the Eagles, the Texans, maybe the Ravens also before they got Derrick Henry, they expected Saquon to come back to them and say, look, I have this. What are you guys willing to offer me maybe to counter this, offer more, maybe you get me to stay? That was the plan from the New York Giants. And once general manager Joe Schoen explained that to John Mara, you know, he processed it, and he really just simply responded with, in a perfect world, I'd still like to have him back, is all that John Mara said. And after that, Joe Schoen kind of in a mindset where it looks like he's already past the idea of trying to keep Saquon. I'm sure I'm not the only person to think that from the first episode. It looked like Schoen was more inclined to just accept the fact that he didn't feel that Saquon was coming back. Rather, with John Mara, you could see from his expression and just how it's crazy when you see the episode that he's just sort of standing there, almost just like a defeated look on his face, like not believing that Saquon really has a good chance of leaving the Giants with how much he's done for them, where they drafted him a while back ago. To lose him for almost nothing, you know, that was sort of starting to set in from John Mara, and just the defeat on his face, which is just like sad to see almost in a way. But Joe Schoen responded to what John Mara said about trying to keep him. Ideally, he said, really their main idea was to bolster the offensive line in order to make sure they get a clear answer on Daniel Jones. It always circles back to Daniel Jones, right? And it has to. It has to circle back to Daniel Jones because they decided to pay him the season before, a lot of money at that. And so with that, you're handcuffed with him for that time being. A lot of decisions are going to be based off of what you did there, especially for some of the big players that you have. Only really Saquon on the offensive side of the ball. They obviously didn't have Brian Burns at that moment, but those things are influenced by your quarterback making a lot of money. And he mentioned he wanted a clear answer on Daniel Jones, almost like basically saying, we made this choice on Daniel Jones. Saquon's not looking good right now, so we have to see if Daniel Jones works, because we've already decided on that, and Saquon might just have to be a casualty for that decision that we make, because we just can't afford him if we want to improve the rest of the team. That's the message, the feeling I was getting from General Manager Joe Schoen when he was talking to John Mara, and now they have no choice now to try to make this as successful as possible. And obviously from that interaction back on February 13th, like I said, this conversation between John Mara and Joe Schoen, Saquon becomes a free agent. Did he come back and say what offer he got with the Eagles? That's probably likely. And then at that point, you saw how Saquon responded to some of the hate he got from Giants fans. He said that they basically didn't offer him anything. So I'm starting to believe that side of it a lot more, rather than the Giants saying, maybe the Giants' point of view is that he just took the deal and went. He never came back. I'm starting to believe more that he got a deal, an offer from the Philadelphia Eagles, and now he probably came back to the Giants and said, they want to pay me this, and maybe they just didn't offer him anything. And when you have $12.5 million standing in front of your face like that as a running back, it's really, the choice is made for you right then and there. Eric says, NFL teams are so hung up on the fact that a quarterback has to be the face of your franchise. If the Giants let Jones test the market, what kind of options would he have? I don't think many. That's what I've been saying. That's what I've been saying, Eric. Too many teams are hung up on just having an okay quarterback, having seen a little glimpse of him, and then giving him, the keys to the franchise right away. And especially when they're comparing, when you're trying to see the value in other players that you have, the quarterback will always take precedent. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but at the same time, in this situation, it always has to do specifics with what you're dealing with a certain team. If it was Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, you're obviously going to prioritize the quarterback ahead of everything. But in this situation, we're talking about Saquon and Daniel Jones. I find it hard to believe to prioritize the quarterback, even though he is probably the most important piece to everything. We're talking about Saquon and Daniel Jones, right? I think it has to go beyond just talking about the positions, and rather looking at the value that the player does bring to you. And it doesn't help that Saquon's a running back, obviously, because that market has been so diluted that all these teams really are hesitant to offer them a lot of money. But everything has to be based off of that, off of the quarterback. And with them paying Daniel Jones a lot of money, now they have no choice but to try and make this work. And this year, like I talked about in previous episodes, they're going to have to try and make this work. We saw them add to the offensive line with John Runyon, bringing him over. It definitely helped. It's a lot better now, that offensive line. They brought in Devin Singletary to replace Saquon in a way. They drafted Malik Neighbors. So they're really trying their best to go all in here and get a final decision on Daniel Jones, because if we talk about worst and best case scenario for the Giants, very different things that could go in perpendicular directions, or just very opposite directions if this season doesn't turn out how they envisioned it. If we look at the worst case scenario, we see more of the same thing. Daniel Jones proves that he's not the guy. He doesn't play that well. It's clear that he's really the weaker link in that offense, for a lack of better terms. He doesn't impress again. You move on next season because you're not convinced by Daniel Jones, and at the end of the day, you're almost forced to move on from Daniel Jones if he doesn't play well. Worst case scenario, maybe he's dealing with injuries again. He just doesn't play good in general. The other pieces are doing all right, but Daniel is really struggling, and you're really left with no choice but to move on next season, because it gets to a point where too many people are talking about it now, and how could you not move on from Saquon? You have to move on. You have to get a new quarterback. How much more do you need for him to show you that, to know that he's not the guy for this franchise? So you're going to be forced to move on next year, and then at that point, big picture, over the last 3 off seasons, you lost Saquon for nothing. You gave a lot of money to Daniel Jones, and now you're forced to move on from that massive contract and start this whole process over again by trying to find a new quarterback without having Saquon Barkley on your team. You could have tried to extend Saquon before Daniel and then maybe lose out on the quarterback. But again, it goes back to your point, Eric, that's a big fear for a lot of teams, that they just don't want to accept losing a quarterback for a running back especially, and they decided to go against it. And now, big picture, next offseason, they could be without a quarterback and without Saquon on their team, and then they're in a really bad spot then compared to what we've seen over the last few seasons. But on the flip side, best case scenario, you get some sort of resemblance from Daniel Jones in that year in 2022. He's healthier. He stays healthy the majority of the year with a better offensive line, an improved wide receiver room. It looks a little bit better. There's more optimism. I don't think playoffs is realistic with this team. Even if they do get better and Daniel Jones is healthy, I just still see them lacking. Compared to other teams in the NFC, I think they're one of the more weaker ones, obviously. So if you get close to 500, maybe a game or two above it or a game below that, or just anywhere in that range, I think it's fair. And you'd feel a lot better about writing out this contract with Daniel Jones, rather than being forced to just release him or just move on from him next offseason. If you're a little bit mid-table average compared to just really bad like you have been, I think that'll be enough to write out his contract at least and not be pressured into doing something next offseason, because once you do that, it just really crumbles from there. I think people just start taking the heaviest decisions at that point, maybe getting rid of Brian Dable, you move on from Daniel Jones, and then you're forced into this situation where you have to see change right away. But if you get something close to mid-tier level of a team, 500 or something like that, I think people will be able to accept Daniel Jones for the remainder of his contract, and then you don't offer him another extension, and then you can move on from there, see where you are, and reevaluate. I think 2 or 3, probably 2 years are left on Daniel Jones' contract. So that is where it stands right now. Best case scenario, it doesn't get too much better, but at least, you're not forced into doing something right away where you're not really ready to do that. So that's where the Giants stand right now. That's where I brought that whole conversation with Joe Shane and John Mara on how that interaction went with Saquon Barkley, and again, how all these decisions are based off of that choice that they made by re-signing Daniel Jones. He could prove everyone wrong. It is a possibility, but it's unlikely at this point, just from what we've seen from him. But that's how they're going to head into 2024. A very young team, led probably by Malik Neighbors, Daniel Jones on that side of the ball. Good defensive additions with Dexter, Brian Burns, and Kayvon Thibodeau, but this is a scoring league. This is a passing league. If you don't have that firepower, it's very hard to compete in a lot of these games where that's all teams focus on. So I don't anticipate them. I'm anticipating more the worst case scenario, if I'm being honest. But who knows? I could be surprised. I could be totally wrong or exactly right. We're going to just have to see how it plays out at this point in time. But that's all we're going to talk about, actually, on the first episode of Hard Knocks, the off-season version. We're going to go into another break, and when we return, some more contract talks, this time around A.J. Terrell, the defensive back for the Atlanta Falcons. He's in a contract year, so we're going to break down what his new contract could look like, and if there's any chance this could be the last year with him with the Atlanta Falcons. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break.